Have you ever been invisible? Not literally, of course, but treated like you don't exist, like your words don't matter, like you're just nobody. That's exactly what happened to Grace Okafor, a young woman whose life changed forever the day a stranger in a black suit walked into her workplace. Grace worked at Henderson Associates, a mid-sized accounting firm in Lagos. Every morning, she'd arrive early, stay late, and pour her heart into every task. But no matter how hard she worked, she remained invisible. Her manager, Mr. Adeyemi, barely knew her name despite 3 years of service. Colleagues took credit for her ideas in meetings. Her suggestions were dismissed, only to be praised when repeated by someone else. Grace told herself it didn't matter. She convinced herself that hard work would eventually be noticed. But deep down, the constant dismissal was eating away at her spirit, piece by piece. Then came the meeting that changed everything. The company was pitching for a major contract with a multinational corporation. Mr. Adeyemi gathered the senior team, but Grace wasn't invited. She wasn't even considered. But here's what nobody knew. Grace had spent the last 6 months developing a revolutionary audit system in her spare time, a system that could save companies millions. She'd done it alone after hours, believing that maybe, just maybe, it would finally make her visible. The day of the pitch arrived. Grace came to work as usual, went to her desk, and watched from the sidelines as the senior team prepared. She said nothing. What would be the point? 2 hours into the meeting, disaster struck. The presentation failed. The software they were demonstrating crashed. Technical errors exposed gaps in their proposal. The client looked unimpressed, gathering their things to leave. Mr. Adeyemi stepped out, desperate. He grabbed the first person he saw. It happened to be Grace. Find me anything, any solution, anything that can save this deal, now. For the first time in 3 years, someone was asking Grace for help. Not acknowledging her, asking. She looked at Mr. Adeyemi, at his desperation, and made a decision that would change her life. I have something, she said quietly, but you have to let me present it myself. Mr. Adeyemi, drowning and grabbing at any lifeline, nodded without thinking. Fine, whatever, just fix this. Grace walked into that conference room carrying her laptop. The senior executives looked confused. The clients looked annoyed. But Grace didn't care anymore. She was done being invisible. She connected her laptop, pulled up her audit system, and began to speak. Not as the invisible girl who was ignored in meetings, but as an expert who knew exactly what she'd created and why it mattered. She walked them through the system's capabilities, real-time financial tracking, automated compliance checks, predictive analytics that could identify problems before they became crises. Her voice was steady. Her knowledge was undeniable. The room was silent. The client had stopped gathering their things. Mr. Adeyemi's mouth was literally hanging open. For the first time, people weren't just looking at Grace. They were seeing her. One of the clients, a woman named Mrs. Chidima Nwasu, interrupted. How long did it take you to develop this? Grace looked at her directly. 6 months, every evening after work, every weekend. Mrs. Nwasu smiled. And your company supported this development? The question hung in the air. Everyone knew the answer. Grace smiled back sadly. No, ma'am, they didn't know I existed until about 10 minutes ago. The silence that followed was deafening. Mr. Adeyemi looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. The other executives suddenly found their papers very interesting, but Mrs. Nwasu just nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she'd suspected. The presentation ended. The clients asked for a private moment to discuss. Grace gathered her laptop and started to leave. That's when Mrs. Nwasu spoke again. Miss Okafor, please stay. You should hear this. 10 minutes later, the clients made their decision. They would award the contract on one condition. Grace Okafor must be the lead consultant on their account. Not Mr. Adeyemi, not the senior team. Grace. But the story doesn't end there. As Grace left the building that evening, still processing what had happened, A black Mercedes pulled up beside her. A man in an expensive suit stepped out, holding a briefcase. "Miss Grace Okafor?" Grace nodded, confused. "My name is Chukwunwa Okeke. I'm an attorney representing your father's estate. I've been searching for you for some time." Grace felt her world tilt. Her father? She hadn't seen him since she was 7 years old, when he'd left for overseas and never returned. Her mother had raised her alone, struggling every day, and died 2 years ago. Grace thought she had no family left. "Your father, Samuel Okafor, was a successful pharmaceutical executive in London. He accumulated substantial assets. He's left you his entire estate, valued at approximately 42 million naira." Grace actually stumbled. The lawyer reached out to steady her. 42 million naira. She'd been struggling to make rent, living on instant noodles some weeks, taking the bus because she couldn't afford car repairs. And now, "There's more," Mr. Okeke said, pulling out another envelope. "Your father left a letter. He wanted me to give it to you personally, to make sure you understood why he did what he did and why he couldn't come back." Grace took the letter with shaking hands. Her father's writing. She'd never seen it before, but somehow she knew it was his. The envelope was worn, as if he'd held it many times before sealing it for the last time. "He wanted you to know," Mr. Okeke said softly, "that he never stopped loving you, that every day away from you was torture, but circumstances beyond his control kept him away, and by the time they changed, he was too ashamed to return with nothing to offer." Grace couldn't speak. The girl who'd been invisible just hours ago was now holding her father's love in one hand and his legacy in the other. The universe had shifted completely. The next morning, Grace walked into Henderson Associates for what would be the last time as an invisible employee. Mr. Adeyemi called her into his office, probably expecting to discuss the new client account. He started talking about team structure, about how she'd need to coordinate with the senior consultants, about reporting processes. Grace let him finish. Then she placed a single sheet of paper on his desk. "My resignation," Grace said simply, effective immediately. "I've realized I deserve to work somewhere that values me before desperation forces them to." Mr. Adeyemi's face went through several colors. "But the client specifically requested you." "Then perhaps you should have valued me before the client had to," Grace replied. There was no anger in her voice, just truth, just dignity, just a woman who finally knew her worth. She walked out of that office, out of that building, and into her new life. Later that day, she met with Mrs. Nwosu, who was delighted to hear Grace was available for independent consulting. "I only work with people who know their worth," Mrs. Nwosu said with a knowing smile. Grace used part of her inheritance to start her own consulting firm, specializing in audit systems for African businesses. She hired people who'd been overlooked, who'd been invisible, who just needed someone to see their potential. She framed her father's letter and kept it in her office. Some days she'd read it and cry. Other days she'd read it and smile. It told her about his regrets, his dreams for her, and his hope that his absence had somehow made her stronger. In a strange way, he'd been right. The years of struggle, of being invisible, of proving herself with no recognition had built something in her. Resilience, self-belief, the unshakable knowledge that her worth wasn't dependent on others seeing it. 6 months after leaving Henderson Associates, Grace attended an industry conference. She was a keynote speaker now, sharing her audit system with companies across the continent. As she walked to the stage, she passed Mr. Adeyemi in the audience. He looked smaller somehow, older. He caught her eye and nodded, a tiny gesture of acknowledgement, maybe regret. Grace nodded back, not forgiveness exactly, but release. He was part of her story, but he didn't define it anymore. As Grace began her presentation, speaking to hundreds of people who'd paid to hear her ideas, she thought about the girl she'd been, the one who'd convinced herself that invisibility was safer than disappointment. She wanted to tell that girl that being invisible wasn't safety, it was slow erasure. That the real danger wasn't in being seen and rejected, it was in never being seen at all, in letting others decide your value. But that girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who'd learned that sometimes life breaks you open, not to destroy you, but to show you what you're really made of. And Grace Okafor was made of steel. Here's what nobody tells you about being invisible. You're never actually invisible. You're just surrounded by people who've chosen not to see you. And the moment you choose to see yourself, everything changes. Grace's story isn't just about inheritance or success or revenge. It's about something more fundamental. The moment you stop waiting for permission to matter. Because you already matter. You always did. Today, Grace's firm has expanded to 12 African countries. She's mentored hundreds of young professionals, and every single person who works for her knows they are seen, valued, and heard from day one. She still keeps her old ID badge from Henderson Associates in a drawer. Sometimes she looks at the photo of that younger, sadder version of herself and whispers, "Thank you for not giving up. Look what we became." And on the wall beside her father's letter hangs another frame. It contains a single sentence she wrote the day she resigned. "I am not invisible. I never was. I was just standing among the blind." So, if you're feeling invisible today, if you're working hard in silence while others take credit, if you're wondering if anyone will ever see your value, remember Grace. Remember that your worth isn't diminished by others' blindness. Keep building, keep creating, keep knowing who you are, because the day will come when the world catches up to what you already know. And when it does, you'll be ready.